My mentor, Delia Cohen, used to go back to basics at every opportunity, no matter the level, knowledge or skill of the listener. I find it can be very useful, even after decades of listening to music and hearing learned and sophisticated talks about it. So I thought I might do the same in a way that would, I hope, serve our study of opera. So music has four parameters. The first is timbre, or tone color, it is sometimes called. It is an acoustical property, depending on the frequencies and the intensities of the sound components. Now, we humans are extremely sensitive to timbre because we have evolved so as to use it to distinguish and evaluate threats that might be lurking. A rustle, a buzz, a hiss, a cry. Our musical instruments produce various timbres, and so the choice of instruments and the ways they are used in music are crucial not only for defining musical styles, but first and foremost, I think, to our emotional response. Now, in opera, timbre is used all the time for dramatic purposes. Opera is the musical genre that involves the most extra musical connections. Timbre can be a source of so many associations and connotations to real life in a very primal, raw even way. It is abundant in film music and television as well, for the same reason. The harp playing arpeggios, for example, we immediately connect it with something tender or gentle, dreamy. If a composer refers to the military, for example, then the sound of trumpets would be a safe bet. Unlike these other three parameters we're going to talk about, timbre cannot really be quantified. It can be classified into categories, but when we talk about music, we usually resort to verbal descriptions, lots of adjectives, such as metallic, gloomy, warm, velvety. The timbre of strings in the orchestra, for example, is often referred to as warm, and that is an attribute we make based in part on the resemblance strings bear to the human voice. The second parameter of music is dynamics, or the level of loudness. In musical performance and musical notation, we use words such as forte, piano, pianissimo, pianissimo, and so on. Those are general or relative terms. However, we can measure loudness by the number of decibels. We usually don't count decibels. We rather refer to a relative sort of scale, louder, quieter. And we should note that various ways of employing loudness influence our emotional response to music. That's the important part. And that includes the use of silence. Silence is a very meaningful and effective sound, which I find to be the trademark of a mature composer. The third parameter of music is duration, the time a sound event lasts. In life, we are used to measuring time in seconds, minutes, hours, and so on. But in music, it is not necessarily absolute time that we care about, although sometimes that too has a role, but rather we care about the sense of relative durations and patterns. We have duration-related concepts like tempi, for example, allegro, largo, prestissimo, and so on. We have meter or time signatures, 4/4, 6/8. We have units like quarter notes, half notes, semiquavers, and so on. In music, as in speech, the various patterns of organization matter to the way we respond to our emotional experience. And this is important in poetry as well. For example, the Greek metrical feet, patterns of stressed and unstressed syllables that can be translated into longer and shorter notes in a regularly repeating pattern. Here too, the important thing to realize is that different patterns would have different effects, even bring about different associations. For example, a very basic example I think would be the anapest, a short, short, long pattern that, given a fast enough tempo, would make us think of galloping horses, right? Excitement and so on. So different rhythmic patterns, different meters and different tempi would change our emotional impression of music. Now the fourth parameter, and that is perhaps the one that gets the most attention in learned analysis, is pitch. How high, how low the sound is. Now Physically, it is an expression of the frequency, oscillations per second, or rather frequencies, the basic and the overtones. And it can be measured in hertzes, but musically, the perception or the sense of pitch is the basis for so many fundamental concepts. For example, intervals. An interval is the distance between two pitches. For example, it can be melodic, like consecutively playing the pitches, right? Or it could be harmonic, simultaneously playing, right? So, for example, the interval of an octave. Octo, 8, so counting 8 notes. For example, from D to D, right? An octave, or a fifth, right? Or a second, minor second, and a major second. We can also look at intervals as the sum of tones and semitones. You may have heard steps and half steps. The same. So in modern times, an octave is divided into 12 equal semitones, and the piano's keyboard demonstrates this perfectly. So for instance, this is semitone, 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 and a tone. Yeah, so on the piano it is very clear. Now, two things important about intervals. One, that the larger they are, the more salient and the more attention-grabbing they are. And you can think of it as having greater potential energy. Now, if you try and singing some intervals, you will realize the difference. For example, a smaller interval, ah, and a larger interval, ah. So it requires more energy, more pull to it, and it becomes more interesting, perhaps, sometimes. The second thing to realize is that intervals are categorized into consonances and dissonances, and that also affects our emotional response. Now, in opera, harnessing that into the drama, into highlighting some really meaningful words, for example, is something that has been there in the beginning, 400 years ago. For example, with Monteverdi's Tu sei morta. So whenever you have a dissonance on a very important word like morta or piango, that would grab our attention, and we would make the metaphor that it is something bad, something stressful, something that requires resolution. The resolution will arrive, if it arrives, on a consonance. So that's the other thing about intervals. Now, intervals are also used as building blocks to make up scales or chords. A scale is when we arrange several pitches in order from the lowest to the highest. In Western classical music, that is tonal music, we refer to an order that is encompassed by an octave. The choice of which pitches to include, and consequently which intervals would be derived from the scale, lead to various options. And we hear of, for instance, minor scale, or a major scale, or a chromatic scale, and so on. Chords can be made using the notes of the scale. Now, if the notes belong to the scale, we are talking about diatonic notes, but they can be non-diatonic. And other chords can be made from combining notes that do not belong, that are non-diatonic. Just like intervals and just like timbres, the important thing here is that chords inspire us with aesthetic or emotional responses. But wait, there's more. Chords can be made to function in a hierarchical way within what we call the tonal system. And I've talked a lot about tonality as a very common metaphor in many operas. On an intuitive level, a sense of tonality is when we feel that the music is pulled towards a center, like gravity force, a reference point. That center of gravity is the tonic. In Western music, things have evolved to a tonal system. We have 12 major keys and 12 minor keys. For example, C major, C minor, F sharp minor, and so on. For example, in a scale of D minor, the tonic is D. Now, the point that is relevant to us in opera from a perspective of dramatic thinking is that as the music unfolds within that tonal system, we feel that sometimes the pull towards the tonic is stronger and sometimes it is weaker. Now, when it is strong, so is our sense of direction, where the music should lead to, if you will. And other times, it is not even present, so we have a sense of losing direction altogether. Opera composers, from the very beginning, have always used this for dramatic purposes. Take, for example, Humperdinck's Hansel and Gretel. So, in Hansel and Gretel, the opening chorale wants to lead to the tonic. So this chorale has a very clear sense of stability, and it repeats whenever there is talk or thinking of home, of faith and family. And there are other things in the music as well, not just the sense of tonality that promotes that same solid, reliable feel. For instance, a strong sense of the beat. For instance, the homophonic texture, all parts going together. But that is one pole of the drama, that the stability, the home, the faith, the church. Now, contrary to this, when the children wander off into the forest, the ambivalence of the cuckoo that changes into a G minor, because you have the cuckoo, and at first it belongs to a major chord, the B flat. But then this third, the interval of the third, becomes part of the G minor chord, which immediately changes the color because it's a minor chord. And then when the children wander off deeper into the forest, we start with this ambivalence and wander off in tonality. We lose a sense of direction. So the chords, if to make a skeleton, would sound like this. Where is the tonic? We don't know. And indeed, at that point, Hansel confesses to Gretel, I don't know the way anymore. And that's where a sort of Wagnerian style creeps in. And so on. So that is losing direction, and it's an appropriate metaphor for what's happening with the kids. In summary, the various ways of organizing pitches, durations, dynamics, and timbres shape both musical styles and, more importantly, our emotional experience while listening.